on to the next step, which is the fleshing process. Ideally, you want to keep this skin in its original form, which is a tube skin, like it was when it came off the animal, but you need some special frames and equipment in order to accomplish that. So I just went ahead and cut it straight up the middle, opened up the arms, and that's just going to make it a little easier to work with. You also want to start this step almost immediately after you skin it, which wasn't possible in this case. I had to put it in the fridge overnight. It's just going to make it a little more difficult. Let's start by removing this ear cartilage. What I did was just invert the ears so they're on the inside, and you'll immediately recognize the part that's actual fur and skin, and the part that you want to peel off, which is this cartilage layer. Take a pair of pliers and peel it off. Takes a good bit of effort. You might have to muscle it a little bit, but should just peel right off. That's a piece of cartilage, we don't want that. We'll go ahead and do the same thing on the other one. Just now realized it's a lot easier to peel off if you just start by splitting it up the middle with your knife. Gives you something to hold on to so you can peel it off a lot easier. So I mentioned doing this step right after you skin the animal is your best bet, and waiting a while will make it a lot more difficult to remove all this flesh. Also, I've noticed with foxes, they tend to be particularly difficult to flesh. With this one, I'm just going to start it off on the beam, and if that doesn't work, I'll try a power washer, see if that does any better. And if I'm still not making progress on this, I'll just take a pocket knife and cut off all this big, obvious meat that's on the hide. And then what I'll do, I'll just layer it with salt, let it dry out really good, and then take a power tool and just sand off all that excess junk and material, and we'll be left with a nice clean skin that's ready to tan. One way or another, all of this junk has to come off before we can get to tanning this hide. Alright, we'll give it a try, see how this works out. I must say I'm not too optimistic that it will, but we'll see. So, starting to make some progress here. I just have to be extra careful not to rip the skin like I did back here. I just sharpened this fleshing knife and it'll dig into the skin real easily. So the thing with foxes is the connective tissue is really tough and the skin is really delicate, so that makes it for some tough fleshing work. And you'll rip the skin very easily, so just got to be super careful when you're doing this. This isn't looking bad. This shoulder area is just ridiculously tough to flesh. That's about all I can do on the beam. I managed to get a good portion of the flesh off. This is about as clean as I'll be able to get it at this point. Gave it a quick once over with my knife, went around the edges, cleaned them up a bit. Regarding this neck and face area, I would say don't even bother trying to get it perfectly clean. Scrape off whatever bits and pieces you can and leave it at that. Throw some salt on there as soon as possible. So I've got the hide tacked down to the floor, and we're going to start by just giving it a light coating of salt. They say you want to use non-iodized salt for this, so I don't know the reasoning behind that, but that's just what I've always used. Just go ahead and start rubbing that into the skin. If I see any pieces of meat that can be peeled off, go ahead and do that. A lot of times that salt will sort of loosen up some of the flesh. Make sure you get up into the tail. Work that salt into every square inch of the hide. Once that salt is all worked in, I'll brush off all this excess. And go ahead and apply another liberal fresh coat of salt. Usually it'll just pour out of here, but there we go. And we want to spread this nice and even. Make sure it covers the entire pelt. And what I'll do is leave this for a day or two, and if I come back and the salt is all crusted over, that means it's absorbed a lot of the moisture that's in this hide, which is a good thing. That's what we want. And I'll go ahead and scrape off that old layer and apply a new layer, and that should be enough to adequately preserve this hide. We want to be real generous with the salt, so use as much as it takes. So So it's been about 48 hours now. You'll notice the hide is starting to contract a little due to the moisture loss, which means the salt is doing its job, absorbing all that moisture and blood. A few crusty spots here and there, which tells me now is the time I'm going to want to switch out all this salt. So I'm going to go ahead and scrape off all this old salt and get a good fresh coating of new salt on there to complete the drying process. Alright, so I waited a bit longer than necessary. It's been about a month and a half now. I'm just now getting around to this next step. But as you can see, this hide is as dry as it'll possibly get. I changed the salt out 2 or 3 times. Just let it get nice and dry. And so we're about ready to move on to the next step and get it ready to tan. And to start off, I'm just going to scrape off or brush off all this salt, unpin these staples, and we'll get going from there. Staples are out. As you can see, nice and stiff. So I'm gonna get my Dremel tool ready. And this is the bit you're gonna need. You're gonna need to go out and buy that bit if you don't have it. We are ready to go. So because this hide is completely dry, we can just essentially just sand off all of this residual fat and muscle tissue that's left on here that we didn't get off with a fleshing knife. And I guess you could call it a dry flesh, what we're about to do here. I think it's a lot more thorough. You get a lot more of the stuff you need off gone, and it's also nice because it thins the skin a bit, which makes for a more supple end product. I switched out the bits. I have a fine tip detailer on there. That'll help me get into the more hard to reach areas and clean things up a bit more. This whole process took about 20 minutes, which isn't bad. Obviously on a bigger animal such as a deer, it'll take a lot longer. I think on my deer it took a little over 2 hours, but still highly effective way of getting it done. I'm gonna go over it once more with a nice coarse piece of sandpaper and get a nice rough texture on there, even it out a bit, and it'll also help the tanning formula penetrate more effectively into the hide. Alright, so at this point the hide is nice and clean, ready to be tanned, and if you want to see that process, you can click on the video on the screen if you see it, or it'll be linked in the description if you don't see it. Obviously, this process of fleshing, particularly this method, is not foolproof. There is a lot that can go wrong if you do it this way. You have to be very careful because the Dremel tool will eat right through the skin if you let it. And also, if you catch a piece of fur while you're doing this, things can go south pretty quickly. So you just have to be really diligent. Try not to make any holes because it can happen very easily if you're not careful. But if you're someone like me who finds the traditional fleshing knife insufficient tool for this task, I highly recommend this method. It's worked really well for me. Anyway, that's going to be it. Thanks for watching the video.